Hi, everyone. We are going to start on Module 2, Models. Okay, so we'll be going over, in regard to models, we're going to basically different approaches to psychopathology, psychological disorders, abnormal behavior. So some of these are going to include your biological approaches, psychological approaches, sociocultural approaches, prevention programs, and then common elements and effective treatments. And with treatments, we will be going over those in every single chapter. So that might be pretty succinct. Okay, so first and foremost, we need to go over what a theory is. This is going to be a set of ideas that are usually evidence-based, providing a framework for questioning, gathering, and interpreting information about a phenomenon. So they're going to describe causes of contributing factors to psychological disorders. In psychology, that is what we develop. We develop theories after many, many years of research and bringing all of those results of research together to come up with a theory. This is going to be a little bit different than some of your harder sciences like chemistry or physics, in which there are some laws. When we're talking about a law, we are talking about cause and effect. We are talking about cause and effect. So as an example, we have the law of gravity, in that literally if I'm holding this pen and if I drop it, we all know that it's going to fall. If it doesn't fall, we're all in trouble anyways, and it doesn't really matter anymore. So that would be a law, cause and effect. I do one thing, another thing will happen for sure 100% of the time. When it comes to theory, theory is a little bit different. Theory is more about correlation and prediction, in that when a phenomenon occurs, there may be a variety of variables that impact it happening. And when we're talking about humans specifically, every human is unique, every psychological disorder is unique. And so as a result of that, all we can work with is correlation. We can say that this variable increases the chances of this happening over here. We cannot say that this variable causes this to happen. That just doesn't work like that. So we can say that things are related in nature. In that, let's say that we know that schizophrenia is very genetically based. And so as a result of that, we can say things like that genetic predisposition to schizophrenia is related to the development of schizophrenia. Just because you have that gene for it doesn't mean it will happen. It just increases the chance that it's going to happen. Okay. We'll go over this as a variety of theories to explain these phenomena as we move through the class. We also have therapy. This will be one of the treatments that we discuss in regard to psychological disorders. Therapy is effective in a vast array of disorders. And these are treatments that target the causal factors of psychological disorders. It's usually based on a theory, and that might be, we have, just as an example, we have like dialectic behavior therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Those are going to address two different types of theories that we believe contribute to psychological disorders. One might be emotional with dialectic behavioral theory, like emotional regulation, whereas with cognitive behavioral therapy, we're looking at cognition, thoughts. Okay, and it's going to be different for each theory of abnormal behavior as well. So with that being said, okay, here are some different models. Now, we have one-dimensional and multidimensional models. One-dimensional models are very short-sighted. I'm just going to tell you that straight up right away. They're going to explain behavior in terms of one cause. And as I just said, there is not going to be just one cause when it comes to psychological disorders, because these single or one-dimensional models are going to only consider maybe biology or trauma or a neurotransmitter deficiency, one explanation, when in fact, that's just not going to be applicable in the realm of psychological disorders because they're so varied and unique. And it ignores information from other areas. If I'm only looking at like a biological perspective of psychological disorders, I'm ignoring the psychological or the cognitive over here. And this is just like explaining schizophrenia being caused only by chemical imbalances. And we know that that is not the only cause of schizophrenia. And so as a result of that, we use multidimensional models. And these are going to be interdisciplinary, eclectic, and integrative. So yes, I teach psychology, and psychology is very important in the study of psychological disorders, but so is biology, so is sociology, so is neuroscience. And what we need to do in order to gain a full appreciation of a psychological disorder is to bring all of those fields together to develop as comprehensive as an explanation as we can. Okay, so let's talk about the biopsychosocial approach. This is one of those multidimensional models. It's integrative, and it includes biology, psychology, and sociology, basically, or the social realm. So we're taking three things into consideration here. And this approach is one in which we state that like psychological symptoms, whether it's anxiety, depression, addiction, psychosis, are going to result from the interaction of all of the biological, psychological, and social. So there are going to be what are called risk factors. These are things that exist, and what they do is they increase the chance of psychological problems. And so when it comes to these risk factors, it could be genetic. It could be something like that's environmental, like genes. It could also be something just social in regard to like trauma. So any of these, and we'll talk about a variety of risk factors that kind of like lead or correlate with psychological disorders, but these are the things that increase the chances you're going to develop a psychological disorder. And there's transdiagnostic risk factors as well. These increase the risk of multiple types of psychological problems. And so just because you have a risk factor for one psychological disorder, you're probably going to have a risk factor for another as well. Okay, so this is the diathesis stress model. This is really important in this approach. And what this model states is that when there's a risk factor and some sort of trigger or stressor in the environment, they're going to come together in the same individual, resulting in psychological symptomatology or a diagnosis. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's talk about addiction. And when I say addiction, it could be to anything. I mean, we commonly think of like your narcotics like fentanyl or heroin or things like that. But when I talk about addiction, I talk about addiction in terms of things like alcohol even. I talk about nicotine, caffeine. You name the substance, and we could probably talk about some aspect of addiction related to it. So in regard to, let's say, addiction here. Let's say that you have a genetic vulnerability to that. Let's say that one of your parents has had problems with addiction for quite some time. And let's say that runs in your family. That's the easiest way to say it. Addiction runs in your family. So as a result of that, you have probably received a gene that predisposes you to addiction. But here's the thing, just because you have the gene doesn't mean that it is going to be expressed. This is epigenetics, which is associated with what you're going to write on this week. You have this gene and it's not turned on, so to speak. You don't come out of the womb an addict. Something happens between then and addiction that turns that gene on. And very commonly, what we see is that it's some sort of life event, some sort of stressor. And this could be anything. And when it comes to this, it could be anything. It's going to vary from person to person, depending on personality, background. There's all sorts of different things, but it could be a trauma. It could be a death in the family. It could be moving. It could be bullying. It could be any sort of adverse life experience. It could be poverty. It could be discrimination. Any sort of life event that is considered to be a stressor by your body. What that does is it can turn that gene on. And obviously, that doesn't mean you're an addict right off the bat. And specifically in regard to addiction, you are going to have to take that first drink or hit. And then what happens is that you are going to be more prone to develop addiction than somebody that does not have that gene. So again, it's kind of like the shot glass here. Now, if you have the genetic, again, you have it runs in your family. Let's say you did have some adverse childhood experiences. Maybe there was some abuse in your childhood. This is where the disorder manifests. It fills up that glass. Okay. Also, in regard to this, and we'll try to keep this out of the way a little bit. Yes, again, person one becomes an alcoholic. And with this one, person two doesn't necessarily become an alcoholic without that genetic tendency. Again, this is theory. This is theoretical because we do know that there are people out there that do not have a genetic predisposition to addiction that do unfortunately become addicted to substances. But in regard to this, Again, your genetic vulnerability or risk factor plus some sort of stressor equals disorder. Okay, and I apologize. My dog is laying next to me and you might have heard him just groan. He may make a cameo in these videos. Okay, this just goes a little bit further in regard to this. You're welcome to look at that. Okay, so in regard to approaches to treatment, again, this could be therapy, and there's a variety of types of therapy, but when it comes to treatment, each approach to abnormality has led to treatments to relieve symptoms. Sometimes we tried, but if we're being honest, there is no such thing as a cure. We do have treatments for most. There's a couple diagnoses we're going to talk about that are not treated very, that can't be treated hardly at all. So what I'm saying is that we don't have great treatments for psychological disorders. In regard to like biological theories, stating that maybe it has to do with an imbalance in neurotransmitters. Individuals who agree more or are more biological in nature, they're probably going to prescribe medication because they're like, okay, we'll give them an antidepressant, even out the neurotransmitters, they're good. In regard to those who are proponents of psychological or like sociocultural approaches, they're probably going to prescribe psychotherapy. So that's going to be like it's going to be your therapy, your CBT, your DBT, you're going to go talk to a therapist. Also, and this is something we don't talk about enough. It's something we are not doing in our society, but those, and I am a proponent of this in regard to the research that's out there, those who are proponents of the sociocultural theory may also work to change social policies or social conditions of vulnerable individuals. So those who already have those risk factors, if we can lessen the chances that they have those additional stressors that fill that glass, we can decrease the chances that they develop psychological disorders. Now, as we go through, and again, we have not done that enough in society necessarily to be able to research it. And so as a result of that, what you're going to see more often than not is a combination of both therapy and psychotropic medications being prescribed and recommended for the treatment of psychological disorders. All right, so let's talk about some biological approaches. All right, so when it comes to the brain, and you learned this in intro, it's divided into three main regions. We have the forebrain. That is going to be the most recently evolved part of your brain. That is the wrinkly part of your brain. That's the wrinkly outside part of your brain. The midbrain, this is going to include things, basically your limbic system. It's going to include basically a chunk of different structures in the interior of your brain. And then you have the hindbrain. This is the most ancient part of our brain. This is the reptilian brain. And that is going to include structures like your brainstem and cerebellum. And again, it's more instinctual in the hindbrain, whereas the forebrain is going to include mechanisms that allow for things like consciousness or executive functioning. So let's talk a little bit about these. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Okay. Again, these are some of the structures in each of these areas. Again, when we're talking about the forebrain, we're talking about the cerebral cortex. Again, that's the wrinkly part of your brain. The thalamus is also a part of this, and the thalamus is like the dispatcher. The thalamus is the structure in the brain that when there's information that comes in through our senses, it is going to end up in the thalamus, and the thalamus is going to take the call and information and then direct that information to wherever it needs to go to be interpreted. The hypothalamus, that's going to be, we will talk about many of these structures. It's going to be responsible for regulating things like hunger, thirst, temperature control. And it's obviously hypo means under, so it's right underneath the thalamus. Also the pituitary gland. That is going to be the master gland that regulates other endocrine glands. So it is the main gland in the body. In the midbrain, you're going to have things like the corpus callosum. That's going to connect the two hemispheres of the brain. The hindbrain, again, these structures are going to be more involved in the unconscious processes that we're not even aware of. Things like the cerebellum. The cerebellum is involved in our ability to balance on our 2 feet, as well as movement, pons. That is going to be associated with sleep and arousal. So this is going to be what brings you down into sleep and then what wakes you up. The reticular formation. This is a network of neurons also related to sleep and arousal, as well as attention. Medulla, unconscious functions like breathing and circulation. So again, with the hindbrain, again, that's an ancient part of the brain. That's the part of the brain that most organisms had that allow them to survive in the world. And as we have evolved, we've developed these additional structures and just moved outward, 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 and now have that cerebral cortex. And as we continue to evolve, because again, there's a reason that our brain is wrinkly. There's a reason it's wrinkly, and that our brain continued to evolve, but the skull doesn't expand. The skull didn't expand. And so as a result of that, the brain folded in on itself, creating fissures. And that is literally why the brain is wrinkly, is because it's continued to evolve, but it can't continue to expand. So it has to turn in on itself, creating those grooves. Okay. All right. So the forebrain, again, this is also good information to know. When it comes to the cerebral cortex specifically, this is going to regulate the most complex activities that we can do. It's the most recently evolved part of the brain. And it's going to have two hemispheres. So split down the middle, two hemispheres. It's connected by that corpus callosum in the middle, and that talks to each other. We'll talk about that to a certain degree. And each hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes. So basically you have 2 of each of these. Okay, you've got 2 frontal lobes, 2 parietal lobes, 2 temporal lobes, and 2 occipital lobes. And we'll talk about each, I believe, in this presentation. Easiest way for me to remember this, if you have not heard me say this, the frontal lobe is on the front. Temporal lobe, it's kind of by your temple. Occipital lobe, it's just on the back of the head. I don't know how else. And the parietal lobe is the last spot. Okay. So I don't think it's going to go into it. So let me just explain each lobe just a little bit in case it doesn't not come back, because this is going to be important as we move through the class, because different psychological disorders cause different activities in different lobes or parts of the brain. So the frontal lobe is going to be involved in a lot of your executive functioning, a lot of your cognition, your thoughts, your decision making, your problem solving, your ability to think through things. Impulsivity, levels of impulsivity. So the most complex parts of humanity. The parietal lobe is going to be involved in kind of somatic or body movements. It's also going to be able to detect movement as well. So much more interested in like the body and movements or sense of touch. That is going to be in a couple of different areas in the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe is specifically involved in vision. So again, you've probably heard this from me, but vision, the light has to go in through your eyes, be reflected off the back of the retina, and transmitted all the way to the back of your brain to be interpreted and create what we call sight. And your temporal lobe is going to be specifically or primarily involved in hearing, which is kind of easy. It's right there. That one's pretty logical. Also within the frontal temporal area of the brain, we have Broca's and Wernicke's area. These are going to include our ability to understand speech and speak. Okay, there's a quick tour of that. Let's see what else we have. We also have a couple other structures, kind of like I was talking about in regard to the thalamus being your dispatcher, and the hypothalamus regulating things like eating, drinking, sexual behavior, and basic emotions. So again, things that aid in survival. If your hypothalamus isn't working correctly, you may not be eating, drinking like you should be. Sorry, totally readjusting. And you can see kind of where all of these areas are. You have the thalamus in the middle, hypothalamus underneath that, pituitary gland below that. Then we will be talking quite a bit about like the amygdala is right here. And then you have this overarching structure called the hippocampus as well. We'll talk about all these structures, again, associated with a variety of psychological disorders. Here's another table. Again, you can get all of these PowerPoints underneath the course resources. Please use these. All right, we also have the limbic system. The limbic system is going to regulate a lot of, again, our instinctual behaviors, things like stress and eating, like we kind of talked about. It's around the central core of the brain. Again, you have that hindbrain, then you have the central core, and then you have the cerebral cortex. You have the amygdala. We're going to talk a lot about the amygdala. This is going to be a structure in the limbic system that's critical in emotions like fear. Fear, it's going to be associated with things like aggression as well. So emotions. Your hippocampus, this is going to play a big part in memory. It's not the only place in the brain that is associated with memory, though, if you remember from intro. All right, we got to talk about neurotransmitters because, again, this is a big part of the biological approach. So stick with me here. Neurotransmitters are going to be biochemicals that are going to act as messengers carrying impulses from one neuron or nerve cell to another in the brain. So you're going to find your neurotransmitters in your brain and in other parts of the nervous system, so they can act in other areas. For example, serotonin. I'll talk about that in a second. Serotonin actually acts even in your gut because it aids in digestion. Okay, so what we have here is what is called a synapse. A synapse is going to be a gap between neurons. So you basically have a neuron with an axon here, and you have an attaching dendrite. And there's this gap between. And in this gap, the synaptic cleft, this is where your neurons or your neurotransmitters are going to be released into to attach to the attaching dendrite. And that's going to pass that message down, depending upon what message it is. Again, this is a review from intro. Your receptors there will be on the membrane of an adjacent neuron, and neurotransmitters from one neuron cross the synapse and bind to receptors on adjacent neurons. So literally what happens here, let's say just dopamine. Let's say I eat a taco. Tacos are going to release a little bit of dopamine. I eat a taco. What's going to happen specifically in the reward pathway in my brain is that there will be a little bit of dopamine released by that area, and that's going to run down the neurons, the neuronal chain, and it's going to run down the neuronal chain at the end, or the axon. That axon is going to release a bunch of dopamine into the synapse, and that will be picked up by these receptors here. And that message is going, it's a chain reaction. It's going to be sent down and sent down, and basically spreading dopamine throughout the brain, making me feel kind of good. That's probably a good place to say, like, I know I talk about it in intro, I can't say that enough, but serotonin is not your feel-good neurotransmitter. People get that very mistaken. Serotonin is going to make you feel calm and content and work on digestion. But your feel-good neurotransmitter, the one that makes you happy, makes you feel good, that's dopamine. Okay, here's just another table depicting all of this. Okay, so what's going to affect the neurotransmitter? This is going to be very important, especially when we talk about things like SSRIs or antidepressants, is this process of reuptake. So this is going to occur when the neuron that initially released the neurotransmitter into that synapse, into that gap, reabsorbs the neurotransmitter. So what happens is, for example, with my dopamine, one neuron is going to release dopamine into that gap, and it's going to attach to receptors and be sent along. But what happens is there's leftover dopamine. There's dopamine just floating around in that gap. So what happens to it? Well, what happens to it is that sending axon, it basically vacuums it back up. That's one way. It vacuums it back up and recycles it to be used later. That's going to be your reuptake. The reuptake is like a vacuum, vacuuming that neurotransmitter or dopamine back up into the axon to be used at a later time, the next time I get a taco. There's also the process of degradation, and this is going to include MAO, monoamine oxidase. And this occurs when the receiving neuron releases an enzyme, that MAO, into the synapse that's going to just break down the neurotransmitter into other biochemicals. So it literally just breaks down what's left in there. All right, this will be important later on. All right, so with biochemical imbalances. So again, we stereotypically people, if somebody has depression, somebody's like, oh, they don't have enough serotonin or they don't have enough of a neurotransmitter. We will talk about this, and I'm going to debunk some of these things, but I will say there are some people out there that have major depressive disorder that do have a deficiency in neurotransmitters. There are also people out there that might have too much of a neurotransmitter like dopamine in their brain. That might be somebody who has schizophrenia that is experiencing hallucinations. And so if there are too little or too many neurotransmitters active in the brain, that can result in some of these psychological symptoms that people experience. Okay, again, we've talked about these a little bit, just got done with serotonin. Couple I left. So again, mood like contentedness or calmness, sleep, digestion, nausea, wound healing, bone health, blood clotting, and sexual desire. It is implicated in disorders like depression, anxiety, some aggressive impulses. There's additional disorders as well. Dopamine, again, or I'm so sorry, I missed it. Dopamine, reinforcement and rewards. This is the feel good. This is the pleasure. When I eat a taco, I'm rewarded by feeling good. And not only that, okay, I eat a taco and I feel good. That dopamine's released. But what also happens is that it's like it writes down that I enjoyed it. It's like it's taking a memo for me to remember later. So it's writing down like, you ate a taco, it felt good, make sure to do this again tomorrow. So it's like it's a memory. It sets a memory in place as well. And you can see here that it is involved in memory, movement. I mean, you look at dopamine, if there are inaccurate amounts of dopamine in the brain, you have disorders like Parkinson's as well. It's also associated with motivation, mood, and attention. Again, pleasure. Pleasure is dopamine, and then there's these other things. So again, I will be delineating between serotonin and dopamine quite a bit just to reinforce that. It is affected by substances. Yes, kind of like I was talking about tacos. If I eat a taco, there's a little bit of dopamine. Now, if somebody were to use something like alcohol or heroin, you're going to get even more of a dopamine rush, reinforcing that usage and wanting somebody to use again, or enhancing the chances they use again. But as time goes on, that dopamine becomes more deficient or less effective. Also, behaviors like sex. Sex is going to result in the release of dopamine to enhance pleasure and to remind the person that like, hey, that felt good. We'll do that again. So that's serotonin and dopamine, norepinephrine and GABA. All right, norepinephrine. This is produced by neurotransmitters specifically in the brainstem. And with adrenaline, okay, so the difference here, adrenaline is going to be a hormone. Noradrenaline is basically a hormone. Okay, that's going to run through your endocrine system and through glands. Whereas norepinephrine is kind of like its cousin in the brain or in the nervous system. So they have very, very similar actions, but one is found in the endocrine system and the other one is found in the nervous system. And so together with adrenaline, norepinephrine is going to increase heart rate. Again, your adrenaline's going. Just think of it like that. Norepinephrine is just like adrenaline. It's going to increase blood pumping from the heart, blood pressure. It's going to break down fat, increase blood sugar levels to provide more energy. Because what happens when norepinephrine is released, especially in large quantities, this can activate like the fight or flight system and basically give you that adrenaline boost in order to do whatever it is you're going to do. Also, so it's a very stimulating neurotransmitter. Cocaine, amphetamine, those are going to prolong the effect of norepinephrine in that synapse. Thus, that norepinephrine continues to basically hang out there. It's not vacuumed up. It's not degraded. It's going to hang out in that synapse and continue to bombard those receptors, thus increasing the amount of energy you have. Yes, cocaine and amphetamine will do that at high levels, but you can think of other drugs, things like nicotine and caffeine. Same thing, just at a little bit lower levels. We also have GABA. So norepinephrine, it's a stimulating neurotransmitter. It's gonna jack us up. GABA is gonna bring us down. So this is gamma aminobutyric acid. It's an amino acid, but it functions as a primary inhibitory. So again, inhibitory, slow things down. Excitatory, speeds things up. Neurotransmitter in the CNS, it slows down the action of other neurotransmitters. So it's gonna slow everything down. It's a tranquilizing effect. Or the tranquilizing effect of some drugs is because they increase the inhibitory action of GABA. Alcohol does this. Alcohol bumps up the activity of GABA in the brain. And so as a result of that, you might see somebody that gets drunk. Let's say they get drunk and all of a sudden they're like slurring their words. They can't put a sentence together. That is specifically because there's probably GABA or enhanced amounts of GABA in those speech areas that are slowing everything down. Same thing with walking. And that, again, somebody drinks too much, that's going to increase the amount of GABA, and that could affect the cerebellum. That happens, somebody might not be able to balance. And so they're stumbling everywhere because, again, it's going to slow reaction time down. It's going to slow our abilities down. Things in the brain are not going to work as quickly as they usually do. Okay, we also have the endocrine system like I've talked about. This is going to be your system of glands producing chemicals called hormones released into the blood. Your hormones are going to, again, they're going to carry messages through the body. They're going to affect our mood, energy, and reactions to stress. So some examples, we have estrogen. We do have growth hormone, testosterone. We'll talk about that in consideration of aggression. Cortisol, that's our stress hormone. Epinephrine, again, that's adrenaline. Oxytocin, that is the chemical that makes us, or the hormone that makes us feel connected. It's like the love and hug chemical. If somebody were to go and use like ecstasy, they have a feeling like they want to be close and touch others and hug others. That's what happens with oxytocin. Glucagon and then melatonin, increased levels of melatonin in the brain, obviously, are going to slow us down and put us to sleep. Okay, and here are your glands. You have your pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, pancreas, adrenal, and then the ovary and testes in men or women and men. All right, so the pituitary gland, it is going to control the secretion of hormones from other glands. So it's basically in charge of everything else. It's going to work in conjunction with the hypothalamus and adrenal glands, and that's going to be associated with responses to stress. If this HPA axis, which we're probably going to talk a little bit about, if it doesn't function correctly, so if the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands do not work appropriately, you can have an inappropriate stress response, thus causing things like anxiety and other disorders. Chronic stress can cause dysregulation in neurotransmitter and endocrine systems, thus potentially resulting in the exacerbation of things like anxiety and causing disorders. All right, so we also have behavioral genetics, and let me just check to see where we're at here. Let me just check really quickly, guys. Okay, we'll go a couple more slides, and then I'm going to bring an end to this video, and I'll go ahead and start another one. That way it doesn't look so overwhelming when you start these. All right, so with behavioral genetics, here we go. This is epigenetics. Again, this applies to what you're writing about. This is the study of genetics, of personality, and of abnormality concerning the following questions. All right. To what extent are behaviors or behavioral tendencies inherited? How are they associated with our genetic codes? And what are the processes by which genes affect behavior? So how do genes affect behavior? Again, kind of talked about that. So just in general, I know you guys know this, but chromosomes contain individual genes, which are segments of long molecules of DNA at various locations on chromosomes within the cell nucleus. So here's the thing, is that all cells contain our entire genetic structure. But here's the thing, is that, again, when we're born, only a small proportion of these genes are going to be turned on or expressed. So an example of a gene that is turned on or expressed very commonly when you are born is that of eye color, hair color. That's all genetic in nature. Those genes are turned on, thus blue eyes, brown hair. But there's plenty that are not turned on. And as a result of that, those traits are not exhibited. Those characteristics are not exhibited. But here's the thing. Okay, in this way, cells do become specialized, with some influencing like liver function, others affecting personality, depending upon what's turned on and what's turned off. Now, what's interesting is that like when environmental factors, things like social, cultural experiences, they can determine whether a gene is turned on or turned off, kind of like what I was talking about with that diathesis stress model. Okay, here we go. Here's a chromosome if you're interested. And so let me see here make sure I've got this. Okay, we're good. So again, we've got this concept called epigenetics, and that genes, on the other hand, genes do influence the type of environment and experiences people choose, depending upon our personality, the genetic basis of that, or what we're exposed to. That may influence the direction we go, paths we take, things we do. And again, with epigenetics, that's the big one here. This is when, again, your stress, nutrition, trauma, negative experiences affect the expression of certain genes, both for the individual and their descendants. And they've been able to determine this. So they've done research on for example, like the children of Holocaust survivors. They did this on the descendants of like the potato famine. They've done this on the descendants of done this research on children who were born to mothers during the Rwandan genocide. And what they're able to find is that like the stress of a genocide or a famine, that stress, it turns on specific genes that are then passed down to to further generations. And so what happens is those genes are passed along, and those descendants are then predisposed to potentially things like high levels of anxiety, PTSD-like symptoms, any other sort of disorder or psychological symptoms related to that trauma. So trauma is intergenerational. Because again, if somebody experiences a stressor, you're going to turn on specific genes and those can be passed along. Okay. All right. So in regard to the probability of depression, we do know that depression is linked to genetics, always also linked to the environment. This is your nature and nurture, nature, nurture, nature, nurture. And in my mind, for the most part, when it comes to psychology, both have something to do with everything. Might be 80-20, might be 50-50, might be 40-60, but they both probably play a role. Okay, so in regard to this, okay, as you increase, again, increase like the genetic predisposition, to increase the predisposition of, let me back up. The genotype doesn't matter. As you increase the extent of maltreatment, if somebody is carrying a gene for depression, the extent of maltreatment is going to increase the chances of them developing depression. So again, this individual is carrying a gene for depression. And again, they've experienced extensive maltreatment, abuse, neglect, you name it. And they have 0.6 probability, 60% chance of developing depression. And this is somebody who they, again, so basically the easiest way, both parents have depression, one parent has depression, neither has depression. And as you have less of a chance in regard to inheriting a gene, you have a lower risk of developing it. Even as like the adverse experiences become more severe. But if you've got those genes, it's going to increase the chances immensely. Thus, again, kind of defending the theory of epigenetics. Okay, with that right there, I'm going to go ahead and stop this video, but I will be right back with probably the other half. So with that being said, I hope everybody's doing well. Please let me know if you need anything at all, and I'll see you later.